What would you do if breaking a law meant facing a punishment designed not just to hurt you, but to completely destroy your dignity, your reputation, or even your hope? Throughout history, rulers and societies have created punishments that seem almost impossible to imagine today. Some were designed to frighten entire populations. Others were meant to make examples out of a single person. But what made these punishments truly terrifying wasn't always the pain. Sometimes it was knowing exactly what was coming. Here are 10 of the most horrifying punishments recorded throughout history. Imagine being sentenced to death and knowing the execution itself was going to become a public spectacle. For centuries in parts of Europe, one of the most infamous punishments was the breaking wheel. The idea was simple but terrifying. The condemned person was restrained against a large wooden wheel, and the executioner would use a heavy weapon to break the person's limbs. The punishment wasn't designed to be quick. That was the point. It was intended to turn suffering into a warning for everyone watching, and that's what makes the breaking wheel so disturbing. Why would a government want people to witness something like this? Because the punishment wasn't only directed at the person being executed, it was directed at everyone standing in the crowd. The message was essentially, this is what happens when you challenge the law. In some cases, the remains were displayed publicly afterward, sometimes for days. Imagine walking through a town and seeing the punishment of another person deliberately left on display. Would you still think about breaking the law, or would fear become part of everyday life? Few punishments inspire a more instinctive fear than the idea of being buried alive. Across different periods and cultures, being buried alive appears in historical accounts as either an execution method, a punishment, or a form of ritual sacrifice. The terror comes from something incredibly simple. There is no escape. Once the earth closes above you, the outside world continues as if nothing happened. And historically, this punishment could carry an additional psychological dimension. The condemned person could sometimes see the people around them before being completely covered. That meant the punishment wasn't simply physical, it was psychological. You knew exactly what was happening. You knew there was nothing you could do, and you knew the people around you were powerless or unwilling to stop it. But here's the question: why would societies choose a punishment this terrifying? Because punishments weren't always about justice. Sometimes they were about creating fear, and few things create fear more effectively than taking away the most basic human ability of all, the ability to escape. Few punishments in the ancient world became as infamous as crucifixion. The Roman Empire used it primarily for people considered criminals, rebels, slaves, and enemies of the state. But crucifixion wasn't simply intended to kill. It was designed to humiliate. The condemned person was publicly displayed, often along roads or other highly visible locations, and that visibility was extremely important. Rome controlled a vast empire containing millions of people. How do you discourage rebellion across such an enormous territory? You make an example. Anyone passing by could see what happened to someone who challenged Roman authority. The punishment could last for a prolonged period, which made it especially feared. But perhaps the most disturbing part was the message behind it. The victim wasn't simply being removed from society. Their suffering was being turned into propaganda. The Romans were essentially saying, the state is more powerful than you. And if you were standing beneath that execution, watching it happen, would you ever dare challenge Rome? Some historical punishments sound so extreme that they almost seem fictional. One of the most infamous is a punishment described in ancient sources as scaphism. According to the accounts, the condemned person was restrained between boats or trough-like vessels, exposed to the elements, and deliberately kept alive for an extended period. Food and drink were reportedly provided in a way intended to attract insects. The important thing to understand is that historians debate the accuracy of these ancient descriptions. The original accounts are limited, and some researchers question whether the punishment was practiced exactly as later writers described. But whether every detail is accurate or not, the story itself survived for centuries as an example of Persian cruelty. And that raises an interesting question. Why do stories about extreme punishments survive so easily? Because fear is one of the most powerful ways to preserve a message. A ruler doesn't need everyone to experience the punishment. They only need everyone to believe it could happen. Ancient Greece gave history one of its most infamous legends, the Brazen Bull. According to ancient accounts, a craftsman supposedly created a large bronze bull for the ruler of Acragas in Sicily. The design was horrifying. A person could supposedly be placed inside the hollow structure, which would then be heated from below. The bull was also said to have been designed so that screams coming from inside would sound like the bellowing of an actual bull. But here's where the story becomes fascinating. Ancient historians disagree about how much of this actually happened. Some details may have been exaggerated over time, and that uncertainty is part of the mystery, because the brazen bull may tell us as much about ancient storytelling as it does about ancient punishment. Why would people create or repeat a story about a punishment this horrifying? Perhaps because rulers wanted to appear capable of unimaginable power, or perhaps because societies have always used terrifying stories to remind people what happens when authority is challenged. But whether the bull was real, exactly as described, the legend survived. And sometimes, a terrifying story can be almost as powerful as the punishment itself. In medieval and early modern England, certain crimes, particularly high treason, could receive one of the most infamous sentences in English history. The punishment became known as being drawn, hanged, and quartered. And even the name tells you how severe it was. The condemned person could be transported publicly to the place of execution, then subjected to a series of punishments before the final stage. The body was eventually divided and displayed. Why? Because the punishment wasn't only about killing someone, it was about sending a political message. Treason was considered an attack on the entire state, so the government wanted everyone to understand the consequences. Imagine living in a society where the punishment for opposing the crown wasn't imprisonment, but public destruction designed specifically to make an example of you. And perhaps the most chilling part? The punishment could continue even after death, because the remains could be displayed publicly. Your death wasn't necessarily the end of the punishment. It could become part of the warning. When people hear the words Spanish Inquisition, they often immediately imagine torture chambers. But some of the most powerful punishments weren't necessarily physical. Public humiliation could be devastating. People accused of religious offenses could be forced to participate in public acts of penitence, sometimes wearing distinctive garments that mark them as offenders. Imagine having to walk through your own community while everyone knew exactly what you had been accused of. No hiding. No anonymity. Your punishment became your identity, and that reveals something important about historical justice. Pain wasn't the only weapon available to authorities. Shame could be just as powerful. A person can survive physical suffering. But what happens when an entire society is encouraged to look at you differently? What happens when your punishment follows you everywhere? That may explain why public humiliation appears in so many societies throughout history, because sometimes the goal isn't simply to make someone suffer, it's to make sure everyone else sees them suffering. Compared with executions, the stocks might sound almost harmless, but imagine being locked into a wooden frame in the center of your town, unable to move, while everyone around you could stop and stare. People could laugh at you, insult you, and sometimes throw things. The punishment was designed to turn embarrassment into a public spectacle, and that's what makes it interesting. Why would something as simple as public shame be used as punishment? Because humans are social creatures. We care deeply about reputation, belonging, and how other people perceive us. Taking those things away can be psychologically powerful. In many historical societies, being publicly shamed could affect your relationships, your business, and your position within the community long after the punishment ended. So perhaps the stocks weren't really about the wooden frame, they were about the crowd. And if you knew that everyone in your town would remember what happened, would that be enough to make you obey? By the 20th century, punishment had changed. Instead of public executions and medieval devices, governments increasingly developed massive prison and forced labor systems. One of the most infamous was the Soviet Gulag system. Millions of people passed through the broader network of forced labor camps during the Stalin era and surrounding periods, including political prisoners, criminals, and people caught up in the Soviet repression. Life in many camps could involve exhausting labor, harsh environmental conditions, inadequate food, disease, and brutal discipline. But what makes the Gulag particularly disturbing is its scale. This wasn't a punishment happening in a town square. It was an enormous system spread across a vast country. People could be taken thousands of miles from home and placed in environments where survival itself became a daily struggle. And that raises a frightening question. What happens when punishment stops being an individual event and becomes an entire system? Perhaps the most disturbing punishments in history aren't the ones with the strangest names. They're the ones where the government didn't simply punish a person for something they had done, but attempted to control every part of their existence. Throughout history, prisoners and political enemies have been subjected to isolation, forced labor, exile, confiscation of property, family separation, and indefinite imprisonment. And the purpose could extend far beyond punishment. It could be control. Imagine living under a government where speaking the wrong words could cost you your freedom, where criticism criticizing the wrong person could destroy your career, where your family could suffer because of your actions. At that point, punishment becomes something more than a consequence. It becomes a warning that follows everyone. And perhaps that's the most powerful punishment of all, the fear that you might be next. History's worst punishments reveal just how far people can go when fear becomes a tool of control. But which punishment shocked you the most? Let me know in the comments, hit the like button, and subscribe to the channel for more dark and fascinating stories from history.